I have to be very careful because if you see where I'm from, those are, oops, okay. I'm from Pacific Coast Conference schools, two of them, which hate each other. And I haven't lectured in the Big Ten in how many years did we figure? And so I was teasing Professor Akar on the way in, looking at the stadium saying, is that where we're going to lecture? No, it's going to be indoors, but it really looks like a stadium to me. I guess I underestimate the importance of sports at Ohio State. So even indoors, you're in a stadium. And what's interesting is that this thing here, which is 2,000 years old in Istanbul, is still subject to a mess of traffic as it was 2,000 years ago. And so is the bell tower in the middle of Xi'an, China, where we did some work with Embark. And this doesn't really exist, but one of the reasons my summary says that there's a new Great Wall in China is that there is a new Great Wall in China full of cars. And I want to talk about transport as a transport problem with a, if you will, a CO2 kicker, because I think that's the way to frame issues of CO2 and transport. I'm not here to debate whether the climate is changing. What I will argue, however, is that most of what needs to be done in transport will reduce or restrain CO2 emissions for its own sake, that is, for the sake of transport, as a co-benefit. And so you don't need to wait for all the glaciers to melt to do something, because most of the world is stuck in traffic. The Precourt Energy Efficiency Center was established by a kind oilman named Jay Precourt, who gave an endowment to us to think about the problems of energy efficiency that don't normally come up in all of the places that work on widgets. And I worked at Lawrence Berkeley Lab for a long time, and they work on widgets, and they invented things like the stuff that reduces the amount of energy it takes to turn alternating current into fluorescent light. They also invented the original science for magnetic resonance MRIs, of which I've had many. But a lot of the energy problem, in my view, most of it is not a widget problem. It's a people problem. And I was brought to Stanford to create a class, which includes looking for interesting master students. Right? It's wonderful. It was 82 in the sun last Sunday in the Bay Area. To try to create a critical mass at Stanford to think about these problems in this more systematic way and to reach out to the wider community, which is one of the reasons I'm very thankful to be invited to be here today. People are willing to move. They really want to move. Every day, several tens of thousands of people steal rides on trains in Calcutta and Mumbai only because the begging is better in town than in the countryside. And when 1,000 people a year are listed by Indian Railways as trespassing, what it means is they fell off the train and died, but the crime they committed was they were on railway property in an unauthorized way. That's how desperate it is around the world to move around. And sometimes you move on 2 wheels, and sometimes you move on 3 wheels, and sometimes you used to move on 2 wheels. Did anybody see the movie Lust and Caution? I must go to weird theaters. It was an Ang Lee movie about Shanghai during World War II, and a lot of it took place very close to where I shot this picture on Nanjing Road. And no matter where I go, nobody has seen that film, and I see so few movies. Sometimes it's a question of 2 paws or 4 paws, and in this particular case, we literally drove up to an elephant in the middle of the shopping district. And if you look, this is a sign from Bangalore that says, "Don't run across the road and confuse the driver." And I wondered, how come the sign says, "Don't kill the pedestrians by running them over"? Well over half of the road deaths in the world are people getting cut down who are on their feet, on pedals, or standing on the sidewalk, and not people strapped into automobiles. And one of the themes of today's talk is not that cars are bad, but that most of the world is way out of balance and assumes that the only way to get around is cars. And by the way, I have shared this with one of your local friends, Honda. And we've worked a lot together in these issues because it's a company that's very concerned about this. I worked in Mexico City. If you know about the new BRT system there, I'm known as the compadre. I shot the picture on the left, standing in the front of a regular trolley bus that's supposed to go southbound, in a bus-only southbound, and those cars literally turn away when they're 2 or 3 meters away, okay? And BRT, which is known as bovine rapid transit, means driving cows around Mexico City. So the point is that you can't make assumptions about the way the streets work. You think traffic in Columbus is bad. I can name 30 or 40 cities in the developing world where it even makes New York look like a piece of cake. Cheesecake, for that matter. This is an Istanbul problem. This is very close to one of the campuses of E2, where you went for a while. Some idiot parked his car in a way that the articulated bus couldn't get by it. Fortunately, Turkey is full of strong men. And these guys got out of the bus, as I photographed it, and there's the driver, and they lifted the offending car out of the way. I have even worse pictures of Istanbul, but I thought I would tease Gosa by showing this one. The point is that most of the world has a problem of getting around. Now, I worked a lot in Stockholm, which has congestion pricing, and before congestion pricing, it was called Stockholm. This is just above Norrtull. This is a mess, but it's the only main route in from the north. Now, one approach to trying to deal with congestion has certain religious overtones. You get the right guy on your side, or the right God on your side, and you simply make the problem part. And there are even overtones related to the Endangered Species Act. Read the sign carefully. Because the point is that as somebody who cycles to our metro to get to the train, to get to Stanford, and cycles to UC Berkeley, it's often full of alligators when you try to drive along. And that's in part because we're accustomed to only moving around in cars. Now, sustainable transport, which is something that the World Bank has discussed in a nice little article, a little book that you can get in PDF. Economic sustainability says it makes economic sense. It's not a money loser. It doesn't cost other people. Social sustainability says it promotes access, it makes rooms for all, and it avoids irreversible binds. This is Slussen in the south part of Stockholm. How many of you read any of the Millennium Trilogy? We have a volunteer here. Well, it all took place a few blocks from there. Listen, when that was built in 1936, the elders said, you know, we drive on the British side. We might want to switch. Let's not build something that in today's money would be billions and billions of dollars that binds us irreversibly to switching sides. And so they built this in a symmetrical way, and a lot of the problems we confront today, it says we have built an almost irreversible United States. And if it had to change, it would be a long and somewhat costly process. It would be costly to do it quickly. It wouldn't be so costly to do it slowly, but it's difficult to keep at it. And then the environmental sustainability thing says you can't leave your junk for the next generation. And that's what CO2 is all about. Now, what I added to this was it's fine to have these principles, but you need governance. You need a rule maker. And to be blunt about it, you can't have a tea party. There have to be rules, or people will pollute, people will cheat. They all do. We have for ever since culture has begun. So somebody has to make rules that tell us how the system works and to make transport work together. And some countries like Sweden have a fantastic, well-interlocked transport system. So I can get on a bus in a tiny town, which gets me to a railroad, which gets me to a larger town, which gets me to the airport. And they all know about each other. That doesn't exist in the United States today. We don't have an integrated transport system, okay? And this is important because if you say, let's make transport more sustainable, then one of the things that happens, if you will, indirectly, is the system of the future emits less CO2 than it would if you didn't make it more sustainable. Now, how many of you recognize this guy? Come on, you gray-haired people in the back. Oh, I'm sorry. It's really funny when you ask this to your students, your graduate students, and the only person that raised his hand was a dad who happened to be in the audience. This is Groucho Marx. I saw him live twice eating his lunch in the same seat at a restaurant when I grew up in LA. He wrote to Chrysler and he said, "Dear Mr. President of Chrysler, is this from your cars? Can you fix it?" And eventually, after 20 years of court cases and chemical proof from Haag and Smith that the stuff in the air really was from combustion of dirty gasoline. In my youth, the air was brown. We did fix it. But it's been contentious. It's been contentious. General Motors liked to brag, we got rid of 99% of all the pollutants in cars. What they don't like to tell you is that they countersued and at almost every moment until people like Honda came along and say, see, it's actually not that hard. So it was a very contentious process. How about energy security? Again, I'm old enough to have remembered President Nixon telling us to turn down our thermostats in the winter. After Watergate, when he said turn down our thermostats, we all turned them up. And when he said turn them up in the summer, we all turned them down. It's been contentious for my entire career, which began actually in 1971. CO2 and climate change are even more contentious. There are no gas lines or other signs that we have a problem. How many of you drove over a pothole today? Road taxes on fuel finance only 40% of the nation's land transport system. We're broke. We're really broke. We're in deep doo-doo or deep pothole, as the case may be. But nobody wants to change that. Reducing externalities, which are the environmental and other sins caused by most activity. And most economists say, okay, what you do is try to figure out what the damage is and represent that damage by a tax on the damager, what the OECD calls the polluter pays principle. Nobody wants to do that. I was called a commie, a Nazi, a socialist, an ideologue in Andy Revkin's climate blog in the New York Times for suggesting this, okay? And there is legitimate concern for the poor, who in the developing world may travel 3 hours to get to work on some combination of foot, minibus, and other things. It's interesting that in the United States, the concern for the poor is concern for even the top 2% of income owners who just can't afford to pay $4 a gallon for their BMW X6s or their Cadillac Escalades. Because you see that on the news when fuel prices rise. You see these well-dressed, well-to-do people complaining about the high price of gasoline as they try to fill 40 gallons into one of these block-long vehicles. If you look at the CO2 in the world, transport on the whole is the most, or was the most rapidly rising source until the recession. If you want to blame it on China, you almost can't see China. And even by 2010, China is maybe 50% larger relative to where it was in 2007. So it's mostly developed countries, but it's growing most rapidly in the developing countries. Now, you'll have a quiz on this tomorrow. The way I approach this analytically is to say that impacts, which are on the left-hand side, depend on the product of 4 components. And 3 of those are vectors, meaning they have multidimensionality. How much we travel, or how much we move stuff around in passenger kilometers or ton kilometers. What share of that travel is on each mode? How much by bus, how much by foot, how much by ox cart, how much by car, how much by airplane, and so forth. How much energy is used for each passenger kilometer on each mode, which is the I, and then what the impacts of using that fuel are. And in this case, let's just focus on CO2. So for example, a diesel car, diesel has a different amount of CO2 in it per unit of energy than gasoline. So the F for diesel will be different than the F for gasoline. Now what's really important, particularly to a planning class, here is technology. This is how much gasoline, how much fuel it uses to move a car a mile with a given horsepower, or to move a ton of car a mile. That's technology. All of the rest is behavior, it's how many people in the car, it's how good or bad the traffic is. For example, short-haul airplanes use twice as much fuel per seat kilometer as a long-haul airplane, a long-haul flight using the same aircraft. And we tend to think, oh, let's fix technology. But if all the other factors that lead to CO2 emissions are non-technical, they have to be thought of too. And how much we travel and what modes we use are very strongly influenced by where we live, where we work, how the community is planned, how dense things are, and the whole thing depends on the price of fuel. So I've just mentioned all these no-nos in terms of policy. And that's one reason why policy winds up saying, I'll give you money if you buy a Prius. I bought a Prius without getting any money just a few months ago, okay? That's very, very important. You have to understand all of these things and link them. You can't just focus only on the so-called efficiency of an automobile or the efficiency of a jet engine or the efficiency of a new Mack truck. Now, a few lessons from the developed world. Fuel economy, how much fuel we really use on the road, is finally improving in the US, and it's been improving for about 10 years in Japan and Europe. We use 50% more fuel per mile than the Europeans because our cars are bigger, not because of any intrinsic difference in efficiency. Japan uses almost as much as we do because, well, their cars are a little smaller, the traffic is horrible. What I take some credit for, and it was in all the blogs last month, is that right now, the amount of travel per capita in virtually every industrialized country in cars has been flat or even falling. A lot of things. Higher fuel prices. I'm older than I was yesterday. Older people use cars less than not older people, and so forth. And we don't know how long that will last, but this is even net of the effects of the recession, by the way. Some of it is because we're traveling more abroad, and foreign air travel is really hard to count in terms of where the people actually come from. And some of it is because congestion is slowing us down. That's less of a problem in Columbus, but it certainly is a problem in Washington, LA, or the San Francisco Bay Area, not to mention Stockholm, London, and Paris, the 6 cities that I've lived in. 4 of those are constrained by water and rivers. One is constrained by the coast, and Paris is constrained by being full of Frenchmen who drive like idiots. Pardon me, but I've been through this. And so one has to ask the question, how come traffic is a mess everywhere? And at some point, is that itself not slowing us down? Why did things change? Prices were important, cafe standards were important. It's both. You need both if you want to make change. And again, there's a nice left-right activist, non-activist debate over that. You need both. And I will say today, as I just noticed in the New York Times, you can't deal with CO2 without something that changes the price of carbon. I'll come back to that. But it's important because everybody's trying to put it off in the future. I was in Rio in 1992. I was actually contacted by an NPR reporter about something related to this today, and he said, Dr. Schipper, and I said, Richard, we met in so-and-so's hotel room in Rio in 1992. How do you remember? And the answer is, it's the last time any of NPR ever called me. We love to give things away. I call it Prius envy. You get money if you buy this. Now you get money if you buy money back if you buy the Volt or if you buy the Leaf. All the work says these kinds of incentives have a small impact. Not nearly the impact that I would say one has to have if one is going to cut oil dependence and reduce CO2 emissions from what they would have otherwise been. And I can brag and say I have a picture on this of the office that I shared 35 years ago with a young man named Steve Chu. Steve is now Energy Secretary. I'm giving lectures at Ohio State. Who's better off? Steve gave a talk. We were both in a meeting with an old guy named Gorbachev on environment. And I wanted to make sure that I got to ask Steve the first question and ask Gorbachev the first question. And I asked Steve about pricing, and he said, prices are off the table. It's incentives. Sorry, Steve. All the academic work says if you really need to bring change, everybody has to face both price and regulatory signals. Incentives alone lead to rebound effects, things like that. There was something in this in the New Yorker a couple months ago. So that's an important lesson, because the developing world is heading as fast as it can to look like us. The other thing is technology is important here, but you and I have to choose to deploy it to do something. And if you look at the record, the average new car today gets almost 2.5 times more ton miles per gallon than the average new car sold in 1980. That's all technology. The average new car today uses about 30% less fuel in tests than the average new car sold in 1980. All the difference between the big increase in efficiency and the modest decline in fuel use per mile, all that led into bigger, stronger cars and more SUVs. Because we chose that. We willed it. We voted that way. Our car companies weren't dumb. They figured out they could sell more macho. How many of you watch the Super Bowl? I admit I watched it. How many of you watch TV regularly? Have you noticed that muscle is back in car ads? So you can see that we're kind of living a contradiction. And when one talks in the developing world and one sees how they're following us, you tend to want to throw your hands up and say, oh my God. Now, a bit about alternative fuels or fools. California had a requirement 20 years ago that every company must produce and sell a certain number of zero-emission vehicles. And I invented elsewhere emission vehicles, so there was no zero-emission vehicle. So that this little car, which actually lives up the hill from me in Berkeley, I've never been able to stop the old lady and ask her, where's your windmill? Do you have photovoltaics on your roof? How do you run your car? This is a Muni bus in downtown San Francisco. It says, this is a zero-emission, it says zero-emission vehicle here. I couldn't get close enough to it without getting run over to get the picture. It's true that San Francisco does have captive hydropower in Yosemite. If you saw the wonderful Ken Burns series on national parks, you'll see that not everybody's happy that we have the Hetch Hetchy Dam. But those green electrons could also run my computer at night. And finally, this is true biofuel. Brazilian ethanol. US biofuel is mostly as much CO2 as the gasoline it replaces and receives a very heavy subsidy. And the question is not whether there aren't alternative fuels. I almost said fools. But there is today no large-scale alternative to the 40 million barrels a day of oil that we use in ground transportation. So it's not a question whether there aren't niches. I have a friend who makes her own biodiesel in a garage in Washington, D.C., and she's the sustainability coordinator at American University. But she gets the stuff from McDonald's. To put it in a kind of a grungy way, how many pimples would we have if we all ate so many Big Macs that we had enough McDonald's grease left over for 1 million barrels a day of this kind of biodiesel? So we still haven't found the answer. Exxon might make it happen with algae. BP, which invested, I think, $250 million in UC Berkeley and $250 million in Illinois, might make it happen with other kinds of very advanced biofuels. It isn't there yet. So we have a fuel problem, even if we don't have a CO2 problem. I don't believe peak oil is an issue. I think we have much more profound problems. And there's tons of oil left, but it's all more expensive. So let's go back to as if, but let's cast it in a different light. A few places in the world have avoided the problem. So A is for avoid. That happens to be the edge of the congestion pricing zone at Singapore, where one of my students is from, and which I think has done a very good job because they chose in 1974 to have congestion pricing and strong land use planning. And it turns out it's really hard to walk downtown. You have to walk indoor in these malls and walk through these sale tables and photographic stores and indoor McDonald's. But it works on transport. The second picture says shift. I'm known as the compadre of Metrobus in Mexico City because my former student was the environment minister, and we got this to happen. That particular line runs 19 kilometers from the north to the south. It's now been extended. The whole system now carries roughly 400,000 people a day, which is roughly what half of what the metro in Washington, D.C. carries, 2 bus lines, okay, cost very little, and 13% of the riders used to drive. There isn't a bus company in the country that wouldn't love to be able to say, I got 13% more riders out of their cars, okay? This is improving. This happens to be the Honda Insight. I obviously put that in because I'm in Ohio today. And this is improving. In this case, this is the plug-in hybrid from the Prius being tested in our offices in Berkeley. And again, none of these is panacea, but they're all ingredients. And for the developing world, the top 2 are really important. As I'll show you, we can hybridize every car in China. But if there are 200 million of them, nobody will be able to move. But they'll at least won't move more efficiently than if they were to not move on bigger cars. And therefore, that again is why the role of thinking about how you move, or in this case, the case of China, how you don't move, and how you deal with this Great Wall problem is so important. Now, let's talk about Latin America, which is the subject of a study that we did at Berkeley for the World Bank. This is Diablo Rojo in Panama, and they have their own Evel Knievel, I guess. That vehicle is the single most important mode of urban transportation in all of Latin America. Colectivo, in Brazil they're called clandestinos because they're not really legal, but they're there, okay? The licensing procedure is not very good. They stop whenever you raise your hand. They're not safe. The last presidential election, the conservative who won was for the metro. The liberal who lost was for a bus rapid transit system. But in a concession, after the conservative won, he actually rode one of these. And my Panamanian student has incredible pictures of them catching fire, rolling over. That's how the majority travel in Latin American cities today, except in one city, which I'll come to in a minute, Curitiba. If we think about car ownership, this is really quite interesting. This is the horizontal axis is per capita GDP, and notice it's a logarithmic scale. We're about 40,000 here. I start with China in 1987 at $1,000 per capita, and it's adjusted for purchasing power parity, regardless of what you think or how many RMB you get when you go to China to exchange money. The RMB is undervalued by at least a factor of 2. In other words, you can really buy that much more in China, particularly if you know where to go. And so, as a result, that makes this more comparable, because this is the United States in 1900, 1924. That's the Depression there. This is World War II when incomes grew, but car ownership went down slightly. There were no cars, basically. And here we are in 2009, and you see that there's barely any growth in car ownership, and it even may have gone down slightly in the peak of the recession, okay? And I've then got Germany in there in the middle. I have Brazil and Mexico, which seem to be tagging after the US. Relative incomes, they have as much motorization as we do, and they may catch up with us. Then I've got Japan, Korea, and a country called China. And China is chasing Korea. It's almost scary. Now, the embarrassing thing is, when I did the study that I'll talk about in a minute, in the early part of the last decade, I said China couldn't possibly have more than 23 million cars in 2010. They had 24 million cars in 2009. And that's using a very correct definition of car, because the Chinese for car, it turns out, can mean any vehicle. Okay? And by some definitions, there are 140 million cars in China, but some of those cars are one-cylinder diesel agricultural vehicles. Okay? So it sure looks like as you get richer, you get more cars, albeit at a lower number in Asia, a higher number in the US, and Germany is a good representation of the average for Europe. How many of you have been to Europe? How many of you have ever driven in Europe? It's a little tricky, okay? And I lived in England for 2 years, and I compromised and drove down the middle. That was the easiest way to do it. If we look at the emissions from road transport relative to GDP per capita, the US and Canada are among the highest. Latin America is number 2. Latin America is trying to be like the US, confirming what we saw when we looked at car ownership. China and India are much lower. They're growing more rapidly from incredibly low base. China today has the same number of cars per capita as we had in 1924. which, believe it or not, was before I was born. So how do we think about transport, particularly urban transport, against this incredible machine of motorization? First, what do you want to do about this, about the CO2 problem? And the answer is, forget that. How do you want your city to evolve? Do you want Columbus-style suburbs, flat, no trees? I mean, I was struck by that, even in allowing for the fact that there are no leaves. Having grown up in the West Coast, I was blown away my first year in Washington, D.C. You couldn't see anything in the summer, and in the winter you could see for miles, because the trees. We only lose our leaves when forest fires burn our trees down in Berkeley. Are you into urban development, or just fixing transport, or just fixing vehicles? So what's the scope of what you want to do? Second, what is the scale? Is it the whole country? Is it the whole urban region? Or is it maybe just one corridor or one street? And then in the case of vehicles, are you going to do things at the national level, like a tax or fuel economy standards, at the state level, or are you going to say if you buy a Prius or a Honda Civic Hybrid, you get $5,000 off your taxes, okay? The second issue is, what are the economics? In other words, what are the economic driving factors? And here again, this notion of externalities, costs that we impose on others that we don't have to pay, such as congestion charge, the cost of congestion, such as accidents, such as air pollution. Air pollution now is less of a problem, but in Latin America and Asia, it's one of the top killers because there's so much junk, particularly particulate matter, in the air. How many of you have been to Mexico City? On a clear day? Sort of, yeah. I was sitting with my former student, the minister, in a meeting, and she suddenly did this to me. She said, the inversion has lifted. We can see Popocatépetl, the volcano. This is like, as we say in Hebrew, a mitzvah. Suddenly, you can see the edge of the city. Now, I grew up in LA and the same thing, the brown air. It's beautiful at 7 a.m., and by 8:30 in the morning, there was this brown layer. So these are real costs. And just to give you an idea, well, I'll come to that. Then the final is, what do you expect? And this is the hardest part. People say, well, in London, they've had congestion pricing, and it's still bad. Well, the data show clearly it is much less bad than it would have been with no congestion pricing. In the case of Stockholm, there are 5 years of daily monitoring, year on year on year, of traffic coming in and out. And also measurements of the improvements in air quality. So you have to define your problem and then say what the outcome should be if your plan is right, and compare that to some sort of business as usual case. Now, if you think about the plight of the president, he's trying to say, our economy is less worse off than it would have been without my program. Well, you can't say that in politics. So this is perhaps the hardest part of transport solutions. Imagine cutting Columbus in 2 halves and have 2 different transport policies, and then come back and compare in 20 years. That, by the way, is kind of what Seattle and Portland try to do. Because Portland has a growth plan that started 35 years ago, and Seattle's is much more recent. And people argue about which is better. That's also the way Seattle and Vancouver argue about the merits of having unrestricted access to guns versus quite restricted access to guns. Now, I can make these jokes about the Canadians because my parents were born in Canada. So the point is, you really need to be able to have a counterfactual. And that's just very, very difficult. Analytically, it can be a big data mess, but above all, it's very difficult politically. So if I tell you that your grandchildren are really going to have problems because it's going to be warmer, it's very difficult to motivate action, even if we didn't have a political divide over the issue. It's not a today or tomorrow problem. The bottom line is, high CO2 emissions are more of a symptom of other transport, land use, and urban planning problems. They're not really a problem in themselves. And if you think of it that way, then it doesn't matter if that senator from Oklahoma, whose last name is Inhofe, is calling hearings on the reality of the climate problem. The issue is, can people move? Is there congestion? Is there air pollution? Because the solutions that make transport better will also reduce air pollution and reduce CO2 emissions. Curitiba, and I've known Jaime Lerner, the guy that kind of created this in the 60s, for a long time, grew up around a road and bus rapid transit system. Bus rapid transit is buses that really have exclusive right-of-way. There are some so-called, Pittsburgh has one. But the whole idea is few have dared to have them in dense urban areas of the US. LA has begun. We hope to get one in San Francisco. And even New York is actually thinking about it. It's institutionally complicated, but having been to Curitiba 3 times, it works fabulously. And the zoning, the way the town grew around, is really amazing. This is a very high density corridor, and there's buses every couple of minutes, and you pay before you get on the bus. In parallel are other roads with lower density, with less rapid buses, and there are cross buses. And so when a big operator, say like Walmart, or the French Walmart came to town, they said, we'd love to have you here, but you better locate where 2 main axes cross. You can't be out there because no one will be able to get there. And they're very, very careful to make sure that key city services, hospitals, schools, are very close to the densest corridors. Makes sense. It may not be the American way, but it really makes sense. And so Curitiba works. Did they ever think about CO2? Never. And the same is true for Singapore. They didn't do these things because they were worried about fuel or CO2. And this, by the way, is before, in the case of Curitiba, before the first oil crisis, before Brazil turned to the real kind of ethanol, you know, the kind that's 60% that we like to drink, as a way to fuel their cars. And it's important to realize that. You can do amazing things if you want a nice city, which have enormous impacts on transport and air quality. You might only want to fix buses. This is a colectivo in Bogota. And he hasn't washed the bus in a few weeks, right? That's Transmilenio. How many of you remember Dario Hidalgo, who got his PhD here? Nobody. He was the deputy director. He succeeded me at Embark in Washington, D.C. This is a remarkable system of now 8 lines, over 1.5 million people a day riding it. And was created under the tutelage of Enrique Peñalosa, who was mayor, who staked everything on it. He got impeached once for removing parked cars from sidewalks. He beat that one. They hated him, but they loved him. And the lesson there is, even just to have one bus lane sometimes takes all that a mayor can do. And remember, Mayor Bloomberg, I was this far away from him in his second speech about proposing congestion pricing in New York 4 years ago, and he didn't get it. He's still mayor, but he didn't get it. It's not easy to do these things. Now, the third thing is about vehicles. That's the Volvo parallel hybrid bus. Any of you been to Seattle? They have wonderful parallel hybrid buses. New York City is overrun with them. They don't make the traffic flow better, but they do save energy. More important, there's less nitrogen oxide and particulate matter emissions because the engines are running more smoothly. And the outgrowth, that's an outgrowth of the Prius. And then in one place in the world, Brazil, you actually have real biofuel from sugarcane-based ethanol. And it's so real that Stockholm runs its diesel buses by modifying them and running them on Brazilian ethanol and some ethanol from paper waste. So the point is, you can also make important impacts if your scope and scale is really all the vehicles or all the fuels. Now, how many economists in the audience? Good, that I can say anything I want. Resources for the Future, which is a place that I have quite a deal of respect for, reviewed all the literature on the different kinds of external costs. For example, Ken Small, who was at UC Irvine, did a study of Los Angeles in the early 90s, and he looked at respiratory disease, and his conclusion was that driving an early 1990s car in the Los Angeles basin, given the air pollution, was basically costing somebody's lungs, and there are ways of costing this, at something like 3 cents a mile, or 60 cents a gallon. That was the externality, and that's a public health bill that I paid when I used to get to junior high school in tears, because that's how strong the air pollution could be. Now, it's better in 1990, but Ken's point was everybody should be paying that cost. How many of you saw Blazing Saddles? Go, this is finally, I got to write film. You remember the scene when normally I would click and show that on YouTube, but I won't do it here. You remember the scene when every bad guy in the world was hired to ride and destroy Rock Ridge, right? And they had all these bad guys, and they're galloping along, and they come to the Governor of the Potomac toll gate. And the chief bad guy says, oh God, somebody go back for a load of dimes. Well, what this is saying is that as soon as you turn the key, you're imposing costs. Less in Columbus because it's not so dense and not so big, but a lot more in LA or San Francisco or New York or Washington, DC, and a lot more. Those costs are mostly air pollution and congestion and accidents. And when you look at the numbers, the costs of climate change per mile driven are actually relatively small. It's not the driving factor in transport. And we talk about energy security, but this country has never done anything about it. So even though you can say, you could in the high estimate say, the entire cost of the 7th Fleet patrolling in the Persian Gulf region to keep oil supply lines, that's not an unreasonable claim to say that's a cost of gasoline. Only you and I don't pay it in gas tax. We pay it in, or we used to pay it when we still paid income taxes. If I read the New York Times today, there's no more income tax, right? So what this says is that CO2 itself probably can't be a driving factor in thinking about climate and transport. Now, here's Metrobus. See how it's smiling? One thing you should notice is we took the center lanes and put a station up in the middle. It's raised. You can't see it, but you pay before you go up in the platforms. All those people in the queue, because there's one less lane, are actually getting where they're going faster, because we got rid of 400 buses that drive like this. And we've measured that with cameras and speed checks and all kinds of things. So there's a benefit to the riders, who are saving 10 minutes each way, and a benefit to the other drivers. And when we add up the numbers for CO2, and the absolute amount may not mean anything to you, but there's roughly a 10% or 8% savings measuring all the traffic before and after. And again, we monitor the before and after over time. And that gap is getting bigger because when we did this, only 8% of the bus riders were former car drivers. And in 2010, it was much closer to 13%, okay? So you add these numbers up, and the surprise is a third of the CO2 savings were because big single and now double articulated buses that have 160 places replaced a bunch of little buses. That's 1/3 of the savings. That's a transport measure, right? And a safety measure, because the bus drivers of the big buses are much better trained. The second savings is because the parallel traffic is moving more smoothly. That again is win-win. The third savings, the third is because the share of people on the bus that used to drive cars is big enough to add up to 13 or 15,000 tons of carbon a year. I didn't pay, this is not a CO2 project, okay? We could have put Seattle-style articulated parallel hybrid buses in the routes for about another $150,000 to $200,000 each, but we would have saved an additional 3,000 tons, very small, at great expense. I'm not against doing that. That's where the world is going, now that that Volvo bus is a much cheaper parallel hybrid alternative than 5 years ago. But the point is, all of this is justified on the basis of transport and basically better city development alone. And when we add up the numbers, how much we value the lower costs of wearing the roads out, how much we value the time saving, how much we value the air pollution benefits, the fuel and the CO2. If CO2 really were worth what some of us think it's worth, that is, it has a damage to the world of something approaching $100 a ton of CO2, which is 88 cents a gallon of gasoline if you translate it. So it's not trivial, at least not in the US. The CO2 is only a small part of the total monetized benefits, and I have a very low value for the value of time. That's probably, the Mexicans would use 5 times that number in their work, and I've excluded the dozen or so fewer fatalities associated with making the roads work better. which is a lot of money. So the point is not that the CO2 savings aren't important, it's they're not the driving factor. And therefore, rather than look at the problem backwards through your CO2 glasses, put the glasses on right, see, I obviously can't do that, and you see the problem differently. Now, it's true that my student with her fingers crossed behind her back said, we never would have made life better for 500,000 people a day if it hadn't been for the $100,000 a year that you're giving us for CO2 savings. Because 2 EU governments have funds that say, we'll pay you to save CO2. And if I sound cynical, it's because I am cynical at that process. The point is that transport is a really important thing to go for on its own sake. And studies of Bogota have shown how the kinds of buildings along the paths of better transport are better. How your property is more valuable if you can get in and out. And I know about that myself because when I left Washington, we made a mint on selling our house because we were only 2 blocks from the metro. And at a time when people in the boonies were underwater because houses had already crashed. But if you live near good transport, when fuel prices were getting higher, you actually did all right. So there is an interesting issue of how good transport can then reshape urban areas that are beset by pollution and noise and things like that. Now let me say a few words about Asia, then we'll have some discussion. Can anybody guess where this is taken? If you've ever been there, you've never forgotten the weird color of the green and orange color. Only one place in the world, Jakarta, which now has 6 bus rapid transit lanes, okay? And when I left a very important East Asia Society for Travel Research meeting in 2006, they told us, we're taking all of you to the airport in a bus. And there were 2 police cars to go first to cut a hole in the traffic for us. And I got to ride shotgun with the first police car. And it was amazing to see how hard, even with 2 police cars and sirens, it was to cut through this mess, okay? I've done some work in China. It's now in the Journal of Transportation and Land Use online with Wei Xuanying and Yang Cheng. That is not LA, that's outside my hotel in Hangzhou in Shanghai. Shanghai now has 11 metro lines. Every time I give this lecture, the number goes up by 1. This is actually Bangalore in India, okay? They want a metro, it's expensive. This is Hanoi, where I went 14 times for a transport and environment project. In the beginning of my Hanoi project, people said congestion is not a problem, we don't value our time, don't worry about that. Now, somehow it's a mystery to me how a Vietnamese has 48 hours a day, so he can afford to waste a lot of it in traffic and still be with his family. Doesn't matter how much money you make, there's only 24 hours in a day. And by 2007, people were saying, oh, sorry, I'm late, traffic jam. Now, in China, even in Shanghai, which is relatively well managed, the number of meetings you could arrange in a day was like the Mexico City number. 2 for sure, and maybe 3 if you're lucky, because you never know whether you could get across town. And Bangalore is the closest I came to ever missing a flight, and the flight was late, of course. And so the point is, these are places with different kinds of motorization and different approaches, and I'll talk briefly about each of them. First of all, just to give you an idea, the average person in Xi'an, by the way, was the historical capital of China for like 600 years. The majority go by, the largest mode share is bus, but over almost half go by walking or cycling in 2003, okay? In Pune, India, which is sort of the Detroit of India, the Columbus of India, it's where there's a lot of car manufacturing, the most obvious thing is the number of people going by motorcycle, 2-wheeler. But walking and cycling is still over 42%, okay? And in Hanoi, by far the dominant mode in 2003 was 2-wheeler. And I've ridden on the back of a professor's 2-wheeler. I won't say to my regret, but it's an experience to be in a cloud of 30 or 40 motorcycles. And while they're relatively clean, there's so many of them that you come home and you have to lie down with a carbon monoxide headache. Now, an average American in a city moves 40 to 45 kilometers a day. The average person in these cities between 5 and 15 kilometers. So we're not talking about a lot of mobility. An overwhelming share of all the travel is to and from work or to and from school. Okay. The notion that there's a Saturday traffic jam shopping, as we experience in Northern Virginia, is unknown so far in most of the developing world. So I defined something called hypermotorization. I'm not trying to say the car is bad, but a very, very rapid increase in the number of private vehicles at a speed beyond which anybody knows what to do is creating enormous problems in China. It's now creating problems in India, and it threatens to take over the streets of the cities of Vietnam. There's very little policy experience. Somebody my age, low 60s in China, grew up walking and cycling. I grew up in LA. I saw it happen slowly in the 50s and 60s. And so the Chinese are kind of trying to figure out what to do, and they're not sure. And in a sense, the technological approach, let's have better traffic signals, let's have better pollution control, without thinking about the people, dominates the policy response so far. And the unintended, maybe, consequences are not obvious. When I speak with Chinese, Indian, or Vietnamese authorities, I say, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you tell me what you want to do, and I can help you sketch out the consequences. And so, again, much higher road facilities per mile driven or per person than we have in this country. Even though the air pollution per mile has gone down a lot, the total is a very, very large burden, and congestion a real threat to productivity. Again, the Great Wall of China, okay? And I had the honor of showing this to the leaders of Nanjing three months ago. And that's a typical traffic jam. And you say, how can that be? And the answer is, nobody knows, except that it's happening in most of the developing world, because motorization is racing far faster than anybody. What country makes the most cars in the world now? China. They may get to 16 million this year, which is bigger than any of our peak years ever. That's amazing. It's remarkable. This is Jinan, traffic jam, right? So my boss, Betty Deacon, who is Gulsa's research great-grandmother, that is, her advisor was a student of one of Betty's students. So there's a family link here. And Nicolas Duda is now at WRI. Abracadabra, there's actually more flow in the bike lane and the pedestrian lane than in the car lane. Now, the cars on average might be moving faster for a while. And that says something's out of balance. And it isn't just a problem for the streets. If you've lived in France, you recognize this Chinese situation, more and more parking on sidewalks. So we're really talking about a problem of urban space. And what we found in our recent article was that the amount of street area is growing up only half the rate of the amount of road area. Now, I was once misquoted by the Indian press. Oh, Dr. Schipper said, we should pave a quarter of our city like Los Angeles. And what I had said was, it didn't help LA to pave a quarter of its city, okay? But Beijing is doing it. They're moving people out. They're up to the 8th Ring Road. The airport used to be out in the boonies, and pretty soon the city will grow out to where the airport is. So, again, if that's what China wants, I can't complain. But I observe that people can't move, and therefore there's a problem. Now, briefly, I won't go into all the numbers. It's in our article. But the point is that here's where China was going. And remember I said I thought I was too high in the business as usual, and they're above that. Here is what happens if you only apply technology, and we gave them a lot of hybrid cars, natural gas cars, cut future CO2 emissions in half. But a livable urban China, which is not yet on the horizon, probably means, maybe 30% more emissions overall from where they got in 2010. But that's not yet on the radar. And it might change, okay? Right now, the new Great Wall of China is, I think, so much of a threat to China's growth that I think authorities are beginning to think about it. Now, India. Again, Pune, I got this photograph. You can get all the money you want to buy a two-wheeler, but there's not a sidewalk in front of that booth. And the bus stops don't hold buses, the little place where the bus pulls in. This is the no-no, which was supposed to be the common man's answer. It's not selling well in India as a mini car because it doesn't get you there any faster, and a two-wheeler, which you can use to sneak through traffic, is much faster. India, China, or my favorite of all, Istanbul, where cities are adding 1,000 cars a day, nobody knows what to do, okay? And when we do the numbers, we get the same thing. Here's where India was going. Here's what happens if you have fuel economy standards and technology. But if you really make transport work, the emissions only come half as high as they would have come by 2030. This is in Transport Research Reviews from 2 years ago. And again, I'm not saying India should do this, but I observe in India that people aren't moving, okay? Finally, Hanoi, same thing. By the way, I took this picture during the avian flu epidemic, and I realized it was probably dumb. You actually couldn't get fresh eggs in Hanoi in December of 2004, okay? And notice, by the way, the masks, because the exhaust, the particulate matter, and the buses are relatively clean. It's hard to move around in Hanoi. Same thing, when we do the numbers, we can think of, we used a master plan for Hanoi 2020 funded by the Japanese. It basically had a trends case where we just imposed different levels of technology and a high mass transit case where there are far fewer cars and somewhat fewer two-wheelers as the basic for transport. And the bottom line is a lot less fuel use and a lot less CO2. So if you only focus on transport, you leave the cities in a mess. So then comes the joker. This is an e-bike. How many of you, are there e-bikes? There must be e-bikes in Columbus. I mean, in Marin County, you know, in the Bay Area, you can get a $4,000 one where the battery's built into the frame. These that were developed in China because many cities were banning ordinary gasoline-driven mopeds because they were noisy and filthy. And suddenly there's 80 million of them, okay? And they're all over Asia, and pretty soon they'll be all over here. For some of us who, it's neat when you're huffing and puffing on your bike home from campus, and some guy goes by you effortlessly in an electric bike, okay? I don't need it. Berkeley, I'm used to riding in hills, but it might be a substitute, or more important, it might be a way to get you to the main trunk of transportation. And therefore, this could be the black swan, the hidden element in somebody's city plan that is based on the Curitiba-style trunk and stem of real rapid transit. You got to get to that thing. So maybe the way to deal with crowded Asian cities is some kind of mini electric car or two-wheeler that's on electricity combined with either bus rapid transit or metros. I haven't said much about metros. I took BART to the airport 2 days ago. I took Metro to the airport today. Everyone do this. Give yourself about an inch. That's $1,000 when you're building a metro or more. And so the point is not that metros aren't good, but they're very, very, very expensive. So you need a high density. Well, everybody in India wants to see, my city has got a metro like the Delhi Metro. And the trouble is, there isn't enough money in India or China to give everybody a metro line, unless you really, really plan carefully, like Shanghai. But Shanghai, including the unregistered people, is almost 20 million people. And Shanghai is now built around this incredible metro line. And for those of you interested, a maglev that goes 429 kilometers an hour at peak for 7 minutes. Then it gets you to the metro. So the point is to think about this as the basis for developing the city. And this is how you and I get to that basis. Now, in South Asia, where there are lots of those little three-wheeler auto rickshaws, one can imagine a system where we all have these now, where we somehow entice these rather undisciplined sorts to being available on call. And we design our metro stations or our BRT stations with lots of private parking for these and lots of easy access for the three-wheelers. That may be a dream, but it may be the only way for cities that contain 20 million people, that's more than Ohio has, right, to get around. Imagine if all Ohioans lived in Columbus. So let's try to focus on the end here. Agency. If you don't have the transport umbrella, going with just fuel economy alone will get you something, but it won't make transport better. Second of all, recognize in the developing world that one of the reasons city air is filthy is there's too much traffic in small vehicles. Even if they're relatively clean, their numbers and the numbers per square kilometer are so big that the air is filthy. And then, yes, think about fuel economy and alternative fuels. But remember, if you need 30 million barrels a day of a substitute for oil, you're in trouble. And remember that fuel economy is what you actually get on the road. So traffic has to be better, and vehicles can't be large. In other words, it may be that good transport is what will determine the future of oil use and emissions in most of the world, and not the other way around, as most modelers tend to put it. Now, just briefly, some scenarios that we did for a Japanese sponsor who thought he could save the world until we looked at the numbers. And I think the world is in trouble, but I'm not sure how to change it. We were asked to bring the United States and Canada CO2 emissions from travel and freight to half of the world's per capita number in 2000. In 2000, the per capita number was about 630 kilograms per capita. That's the world average CO2 for transport. Anybody want to guess what it is in the US? 5,000. So we're big, okay? Canada is actually a little lower than we are. We had one approach where we started with that number and worked backwards and scared the hell out of everybody because the numbers changed radically. But we also worked with the International Council for Clean Transport, who did their best thinkable projections. And then the answers, we didn't get to the target, but people weren't as frightened. And the backcasting is really interesting because it challenges you to think about the unthinkable, okay? The projections are interesting because it shows you how far you think you can push today's variables, today's technology, and today's travel trends. So here is North America, and I've added travel and freight. All I'll say is in the projections, we didn't get to the target. In these projections, we got the United States down to the unthinkable level of mobility that Canada has today. Again, my Canadian roots, I suppose, okay? Now, this is a little above the various targets that the President has echoed, 80% below 1990 by 2050. I think that's achievable, but you don't get there by starting in 2049. And I remember, and I can say this for the record, I was asked by several people in the Clinton administration to do the number crunching for what was called the President's Council for Sustainable Development. Okay, and so Energy Secretary was there, Transport Secretary was there. I called it the Council for Developing a Sustainable Presidency. And I was under strict orders. Nothing in the work can have to happen during President Clinton's second term. President Bush just forgot the whole problem. But you see my point. Nobody wants to do this, even though it's always least costly if you eat away at it little by little every year. And so I have no doubt that this is achievable, maybe even this. But when I did similar work right after the Kyoto Agreement, the same thing. If the US expects to change in 2009 and reach some sort of target in 2010, it can't do that. And that's the political problem about changing transport. It's easy to change over the very long run with strong stimuli. You can't change it overnight. And for Latin America, the difference between where they are and where they could be is not that big. But compared to where they were going, it's a big change. And so my bottom line here is, what is driving this? I'll skip that part. The key message is, and this is important, transport is important to CO2. CO2 is not that important to transport. Freight, which I haven't talked about, may be harder to change unless our economies continue to dematerialize, less stuff at a more rapid rate. And we have to remember we can't just focus on technology. With all due respect to what Honda can do, it's the number of Hondas and how far we drive them, as well as how much fuel they use. And so, the ongoing lessons. We've had a respite in the developing countries, a pause in emissions. No one knows what's going to happen with the economic recovery, but we do foresee oil prices rising somewhat as demand picks up around the world, okay? We need a national transport system overhaul. Yesterday, the head of the third bipartisan commission was in my lecture, Emil Frankel. He was Assistant Secretary of Transport for Policy under Bush II, great man. He's exhausted. Nobody wants to pay the bill for transport, and nobody wants to make you and I, who move ourselves around, have to pay for it. Developing countries, I think what Mexico City showed us is you can save oil and CO2 without trying, but you have to want to change transport. And as we've learned, that's a very difficult thing. Motorization is an enormous, it's driving the Chinese economy, but there's no place to drive. And so the problem there is how to change that, and whether the people in Vietnam, China, and India who've read our work and who've engaged us are willing to take it seriously. And so, again, and this is a message particularly for the oil people in the world, and I work a lot with them. Think about the future as a transport-constrained future, not an oil-constrained future, not a CO. We're not going to melt. The problem may be that transport overtakes oil itself as the biggest problem for transport. And we're talking about making access, making basic access work. A 3-hour commute for a poor person in Mexico City is no way to live, and that's the one-way commute. So the umbrella of sustainable transport is really important to go first before anything on CO2. And I might remind you that there is no transport in the international COP process. And I think that's good, because transport is not something that environmental ministers can negotiate. They're not empowered to do that. We got to make cars more efficient and smaller. We have to fix freight, and we have to integrate CO2 into other problem solving. And that's where economics comes in, and that's where people get really itchy, because they would like to forget about it. Part of what I've said to people who talk about these massive R&D programs is part of the CO2 problem is how I move, how you move, how this computer got to where we got. It doesn't all have to change radically, but it all has to adjust slowly. And that's what nobody seems to want to do. And that's why we say you got to get the horse transport ahead of the cart, which is CO2, and not the other way around. I have to view this as a transport problem, because after all, suppose we had a car that absorbed all its own CO2. We still have a transport mess. Thank you very much.